Most folks in Kansas Territory couldn't remember a time when Daisy Elwood wasn't called the ugly girl. That name stuck to her like dust on a fence post, whispered in mercantiles and muttered at church gatherings. But here's what nobody knew. Daisy wasn't born broken. She was made that way. When Daisy turned 10, her father Thomas died from a winter cough that wouldn't quit. Before they'd even finished covering his grave, her stepmother Isabel locked every door in the house and announced that things were about to change. Nobody thought much of it at first. Isabel had always been cold, even when Thomas was alive. But what came next? That was something else entirely. The very first week after the burial, Isabel dragged Daisy upstairs to the attic, a cramped space no bigger than a horse stall with one clouded window and rats in the corners. "You'll sleep here now," Isabel said, dropping a chipped lamp at Daisy's feet. "The girls need space downstairs. You don't need much." Daisy never answered. She'd already learned that speaking only brought more pain. Isabel's two daughters, Faye and Clara, were 5 and 7 years older than Daisy, and they'd inherited their mother's cruelty like a family heirloom. They pulled Daisy's hair until strands came loose in their fingers. Clara kicked her legs when she passed, always pretending it was an accident. Both of them would gather by the kitchen door whenever Isabel's voice rose, whispering excitedly, waiting to see what punishment would come next. The scars on Daisy's face didn't appear all at once. They came gradually, methodically. A backhand across the cheek for dropping a bowl left a cut that never quite healed right. A tin mug thrown in rage split her eyebrow open. A broken mirror frame hurled across the room carved a jagged line down her jaw. The townspeople only saw the aftermath. A thin, pale girl who never made eye contact. They assumed she was cursed or sickly, or just unfortunately born. And because the West wasn't kind to the weak or the odd, the whispers multiplied. "She looks like a nightmare had a child," someone muttered at the mercantile. "Poor thing's cursed," another agreed. "Wouldn't want her near my boys." Isabel loved hearing those things. It validated her story that Daisy was troublesome, ungrateful, undeserving of sympathy. Whenever Daisy returned from errands, Isabel demanded a full account. Who she'd talked to, who'd looked at her, what she'd touched. If Daisy hesitated, a slap corrected her. The chores were endless. Hauling water from the creek before dawn, chopping firewood with a dull axe until her palms bled, scrubbing floors on her knees for hours, washing laundry in water so cold it numbed her fingers. Most nights, she went to bed without supper, if the work wasn't done fast enough. In the attic darkness, Daisy would wrap her arms around herself for warmth, listening to the muffled laughter of Isabel and her daughters downstairs. Sometimes she whispered the same words over and over just to hear her own voice, terrified she might lose it entirely if she stayed silent too long. The only thing she'd kept from her mother was an old dress, dark blue cotton worn thin from years, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. She'd touch it sometimes, smoothing the faded fabric, imagining her mother's hands doing the same. It was the closest thing she had to comfort. But everything changed one dusty morning in early summer. News spread across Kansas Territory like wildfire. The Territorial Council would host a grand social gathering, open to every resident, rich or poor. A full evening of music, lantern light, and dancing to celebrate a new railway contract. Merchants scrambled to prepare stalls. Saloon owners hustled with their kegs. Women hurried to sew or mend their finest dresses. And Daisy, from her attic prison, heard the news through her small window, carried on the voices of passing schoolchildren. She froze. A town event she was allowed to attend. Nobody had forbidden her. Nobody had said she wasn't welcome. For the first time in years, something inside her chest sparked, tiny and hesitant, like a flame that didn't know if it deserved to burn. Downstairs, Faye's voice cut through the walls. "Mother, she better not think she's coming with us," Clara added with a laugh. "It'll ruin everything if she shows up." Isabel's voice dropped low, amused in a dark way. "Oh, let her go. Let her. It'll be a good laugh for the whole town." The three of them burst into sharp, excited laughter that echoed through the house. Upstairs, Daisy didn't hear their whispers. She only heard the wind through the cracked window and her own heart pounding. For the first time in her life, she imagined what it might feel like to stand in a room full of lanterns and music and not be invisible. She had no idea that night would change everything. By the morning of the Kansas Grand Ball, the Elwood house buzzed with cruel excitement. Faye and Clara giggled downstairs, trying on ribbons and holding dresses against the windows. Isabel barked orders between mouthfuls of breakfast, her voice sharp as kitchen knives. Then she called up the stairs. "Daisy, go make yourself presentable. As presentable as you can manage anyway." Daisy didn't answer. She simply retreated to her attic, where she'd spent half the night stitching her mother's old blue dress. The fabric had thinned from years of disuse, faded like river stones left too long in the sun. But she'd repaired what she could, reinforcing weak spots, trimming frayed edges, washing it in the cold creek until it lost the attic smell. She didn't expect to look beautiful. She only wanted to look like herself, or who she might have been if life had been different. By late afternoon, Daisy slipped into the dress and braided her hair, tying it back with a strip of faded cloth. For the first time in many seasons, her hands trembled with something like anticipation. When she stepped downstairs, the room went silent. Faye straightened mid-laugh. Clara's smirk faltered. Isabel's eyebrows lifted in slow, mocking surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," Isabel drawled. "The attic rat's trying on her Sunday manners." Faye snorted. "It's still an old rag, Mother." But Clara studied Daisy up and down with narrowed eyes. "She actually tried," she said, and her voice held the faintest edge of something that might have been jealousy. Daisy kept her gaze lowered, but steady. The wagon ride to the event grounds was long and dusty. Faye and Clara chattered about which young ranchers would attend, which councilman might notice them. Daisy sat on the edge of the wooden seat, hands tight in her lap, her stomach coiled like a spring. The grand ball wasn't held in a fancy hall. Kansas didn't have one. Instead, the town had pitched a massive canvas pavilion near the river, 30 yards long. Lanterns hung from beams. The ground was scattered with sawdust to keep boots from slipping. Musicians tuned their fiddles in the rear corner. The smell of roasted beef and fresh bread drifted from the cooking tents. Daisy stood outside the pavilion for a long moment, afraid to step inside. The air inside hummed with laughter, boots stomping, skirts sweeping. Everyone seemed brighter, more alive, as if the whole town had been reborn in lamplight. Then Isabel's hand clamped around Daisy's arm. "Don't loiter," she hissed. "If you're coming, walk in like a human being." Daisy's heart thudded. She stepped into the tent. Conversation dipped. Just a little, but enough. A few heads turned. Whispers started immediately, like flies gathering around a carcass. "That's the Elwood girl. Lord, she's bony as a fence rail. Why'd she bother coming? Poor thing thinks a dress will cure her." Heat crawled up Daisy's neck. She kept her eyes on the floorboards. Faye and Clara deliberately drifted toward the crowded center where men were gathering for the first dance. They pushed Daisy forward with fake encouragement, loud enough for others to hear. "Go on, you deserve some fun too." "Yeah, show off that beautiful dress." People laughed, thinking it a joke. The music struck its opening notes, and suddenly Daisy was in the middle of the floor, completely exposed. A dozen men stood only a few steps away. None of them offered their hand. Some looked away immediately. Others stared at her like she was something pitiful. One young ranch hand muttered, "Hell no," before turning his back. Her face burned. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and chest. Faye and Clara watched nearby, delighted. Isabel hid a smile behind her fan. Daisy didn't know where to go. Her feet wouldn't move. The room spun with humiliation. She lowered her head, waiting for the ground to swallow her. That's when she saw him. A man stood near the serving tables, a tray balanced on one hand. Apache features, sun-browned skin. Dark hair tied back with a leather cord. He wore a cook's apron stained with gravy and smoke. Russell. She recognized him. He'd delivered bread to the Elwood house before, though they'd never spoken. He watched the scene quietly, jaw tightening, as if deciding something. Then he set the tray aside, wiped his hands on a cloth, and walked straight toward her. Gasps fluttered across the room like startled birds. Russell stopped a few inches from Daisy. He didn't stare at her scars or flinch from the lantern light catching them. He spoke in a low voice, calm and respectful. "Ma'am," he said, "would you like to dance?" Daisy blinked. She thought she'd misheard. Behind her, someone scoffed. "The Apache cook, with her?" Another chuckled. "Now that's a sight. The ugly girl and the kitchen boy." Russell ignored them completely. Daisy's lips parted, but no sound came out. She wasn't used to being addressed with politeness, not by anyone, much less a stranger. Russell extended his hand. She hesitated, then slowly, almost fearfully, placed her hand in his. The contact was warm, steady. He led her into the dance with quiet certainty. They didn't glide like polished dancers. Their steps were imperfect, her body stiff from years of being told to shrink, his boots squeaking on the sawdust floor. But they moved together, finding a rhythm that belonged to neither the music nor the crowd. Just themselves. After a moment, Daisy whispered, "Why? Why did you ask me?" Russell kept his eyes on hers. Not pitying, not studying, simply present. "I've worked these events for years," he said. "I cook for half the town. I hear what folks say. And I've never once seen you treated right." She blinked, startled. "You're different," he added, softer now. "Not in the way they mean, in the way that matters." Daisy didn't smile. She didn't know how. But something loosened inside her chest. Something that had been tight for years. The music ended. People clapped. A few snickered. But for the first time in her memory, Daisy didn't feel entirely alone. What happened next? Nobody could have predicted it. The morning after the Kansas Grand Ball dawned bright and windless, but the stillness didn't last. By midday, gossip stirred through town like dust devils across the prairie. The sight of a poor Apache cook dancing with the ugly Elwood girl was more than enough fuel to last them a week. By sundown, the story had split and mutated into half a dozen shapes. Some people swore Daisy had begged him to dance. Others said Russell had done it on a dare. One woman at the Mercantile laughed so hard she nearly choked, describing how Daisy looked like a scared mule on the dance floor. Then the newspaper got involved. The Kansas Territorial Daily had a slow news week, so by the next morning, a crude cartoon appeared on page 2. A girl with a crooked face and a tall, dark-skinned man with long hair, both drawn to look ridiculous. The title read, "A Curious Pair at the Grand Ball." It didn't name them outright, but everyone knew exactly who it meant. Isabel was the first to see it. She didn't scream, she didn't gasp. She turned the kitchen quiet as a grave by simply setting her coffee cup down. Faye and Clara froze mid-laugh, noticing the shift in her shoulders. "Mother, what's wrong?" Faye asked. Isabel held up the newspaper with 2 fingers, her face pinched with fury so sharp it could cut tin. "This," she spat, "this filth. They've printed us into shame." Clara grabbed the paper and giggled at the drawing. "It really does look like Daisy." Isabel slapped her daughter across the mouth so hard it made a crack like a snapped twig. "Do you think this is funny?" she hissed. "They mention our family in the article. They call her a reminder of the Elwood misfortune. They call me foolish for letting her attend." She tore the paper into jagged strips and flung them across the table like dead leaves. Her eyes fell on Daisy, who stood frozen near the doorway holding a bucket of water. "You," Isabel hissed. "This is your fault." Daisy didn't speak. The words, "I'm sorry," hovered in her throat, but felt useless. Nothing she said ever mattered. Isabel stalked toward her, snatching the bucket from her hands and dumping the cold water onto the floor. "You shamed this household. You made fools of us. If you had an ounce of sense, you would have stayed hidden like you usually do." Faye and Clara flanked their mother like twin shadows in expensive dresses. "Maybe she liked the attention," Clara sneered. "Maybe she thought someone wanted her," Faye added, laughing. Isabel jabbed a finger into Daisy's shoulder. "Everywhere I went today, people whispered. Men laughed. Women smirked. I have enough problems without carrying your humiliation on my back. Daisy swallowed, her throat burning. I didn't ask for any of it, she said quietly. Isabel's face turned cold and slow, the way a storm front crawls over the horizon. But you caused it, and now you'll fix it. Daisy's palms went cold. Fix it? How? Isabel's lips curled into something that might have been a smile but looked more like a threat. You'll marry that Apache boy, she said. Since the whole town seems convinced you're a pair, go prove them right. Then you can leave my house and stop dragging us down. Faye laughed, clapping her hands. Oh, Mother, that's perfect, Clara chimed in. At least someone wants her. But they misread Daisy's silence. They thought she was ashamed. They didn't realize she was thinking, really thinking, for the first time in years. Marriage. Not because she believed in love, not because she expected kindness, but because it meant escape. A way out of this house, out of the attic, out of the hands that had hurt her since childhood. She lifted her chin a fraction. The first tiny act of defiance in a decade. If that is what you want, Daisy said softly, I'll go speak to him. The room paused. Even Isabel blinked, surprised by the sudden compliance. Good, her stepmother finally said. The sooner, the better. What Isabel didn't know was that she'd just handed Daisy the key to her own freedom. Russell didn't know any of this when he stepped out behind the grain store after work. He'd just finished cleaning the kitchen and wanted nothing more than to sit for a minute in the evening breeze. Instead, he found Daisy standing there, her hands clenched in front of her skirt. He stopped short. Ma'am, you all right? Daisy looked up, and the fading light caught the bruise on her cheek, fresh and dark. Something hot and heavy pressed behind Russell's ribs when he saw it. He'd seen enough violence in his life to recognize the shape of a handprint. Daisy didn't try to hide it. She only breathed out slowly, steadying herself. I need to ask you something, she said. Russell nodded once. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a good listener. People are talking, Daisy continued. They're saying things about us. About that dance. She swallowed. My stepmother wants me gone. She said I should marry you since everyone thinks we're... She glanced aside, embarrassed. Since they're laughing. Russell tensed, not in anger at her, but at the town's cruelty. Daisy, he said gently, I didn't dance with you to make trouble. I know, she whispered. I know you didn't. Silence stretched between them. The hot evening wind rustled the tall grass behind the store. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped. Russell asked quietly, Is that really what you want? Marriage to me? She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. It's not about wanting, it's about having no place else to go. It was the most honest thing she'd ever spoken to anyone besides herself. Russell felt the truth of it hit him like a blow. No softness, no illusion, just survival. He took a slow breath. I won't turn you away, he said. Not if you need a safe place, but I won't make you do something that harms you more. His voice steadied. If you choose this, it has to be your choice, not theirs. Daisy lifted her head, not much, just enough to meet his eyes. Then she nodded. It is my choice, she said. And for the first time since he'd met her, Russell saw something flicker inside her eyes. Not hope, not yet, but the faint, stubborn will of someone who refused to stay buried. A fragile beginning. The kind only two outcasts could recognize. Something was shifting. And Kansas, with all its cruel whispers, had no idea what it had started. The wedding took place one gray afternoon at the smallest church in Kansas Territory, a squat white building that leaned slightly to the east, like it had grown tired of holding itself upright. Storm clouds hung low, promising rain but refusing to deliver. The air smelled of dust and pine sap. It wasn't a romantic day. It wasn't meant to be. Daisy arrived alone. Faye and Clara had refused to ride with her, claiming it would ruin their mood to be seen beside her. Isabel said she had household matters, though Daisy suspected she simply didn't want to face the pitying glances of neighbors who'd read the newspaper's cruel cartoon. So Daisy walked the half-mile to the church by herself, her old blue dress brushing against her ankles, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She didn't expect joy. She didn't expect celebration. She only expected escape, a thin slice of freedom from the household that had crushed her since childhood. Russell was already inside when she entered. He stood near the altar, hat in his hands, dark hair tied back neatly. His shirt was clean but worn at the seams, and his boots were nearly giving out where the soles met leather. He'd shaved that morning, though the stubble was already creeping back along his jaw. He wasn't a man dressed for a wedding, just a man doing his best with what he had. The preacher looked up as Daisy stepped in, and his expression flickered with something between pity and judgment. He glanced at Russell, then back at Daisy. "This the young lady?" he asked, not unkind, but not warm either. "Yes, sir," Russell replied. "All right," the preacher sighed, flipping through his worn Bible. "Let's get to it." No pews were filled. No family sat in the back row. No friends watched with smiling faces. The only witnesses were a couple of ranch hands who'd wandered in out of curiosity and now stood against the wall, whispering quietly to each other. Russell nodded at Daisy, a small gesture of reassurance. "Evening, ma'am." She nodded back. "Evening." The preacher cleared his throat. "We're gathered here to join these two souls in matrimony." His voice echoed slightly in the empty church. "Now, do either of you have prepared vows?" Daisy felt her pulse jump. She hadn't thought of vows. She barely survived each day. She didn't know how to make promises like other people did. Russell spoke first, voice steady and plain. "I don't have fancy words," he said, eyes on Daisy. "But I'll tell you the truth. I won't harm you. I won't raise my hand to you. And I won't treat you like a burden." Daisy felt the breath leave her chest. Not because the vow was poetic. It wasn't. But because it was the first vow in her life that addressed the things she feared most. The preacher nodded. "And you, miss?" Daisy swallowed, fingers twisting together. "I don't expect much," she whispered. "I don't know how to be a wife. Not really. But I can try. And I won't bring trouble on you. That's all I can promise." Russell gave a small nod, as if that was more than enough. The preacher closed his Bible. "Place your hands together." Daisy lifted her trembling hand. Russell's met it halfway, warm, firm, steadying. "By the authority of Kansas Territory," the preacher said, "I declare you husband and wife." He hesitated slightly, looking between them. "You may—" Russell spared him the awkwardness. He didn't kiss her. He just bowed his head politely. "Thank you," Daisy whispered. Russell answered just as quietly, "You're welcome." There was no applause, no rice thrown, no music. Just silence. The ranch hands left first, murmuring among themselves. Daisy thought she caught one of them mutter something like, "Well, ain't that a sad sight?" But she wasn't sure. It didn't matter. The preacher signed the marriage paper and handed it to Russell. "That'll do. May the Lord watch over you both." Russell nodded, folded the document, and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He turned to Daisy. "You ready to go?" he asked. She nodded once. Outside, the sky had darkened. Wind picked up, pushing dust across the open field behind the church. Russell led her to an old mare tied to a fence post, a bay horse with a white blaze and ribs faintly showing. A small wooden cart waited behind her, patched in places with mismatched planks. Russell looked embarrassed. "It's all I've got." Daisy shook her head. "It's fine." It wasn't fine, not really. Nothing about their situation was fine. But the honesty of it was more comforting than the polished cruelty of the Elwood house. They climbed into the cart. Kansas shrank behind them as they rode, the church, the road, the cluster of buildings all fading into the evening haze. For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the wheels creaking and the horses' slow hooves hitting dry earth. At last, Russell said, "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but if you've got questions, I'll answer what I can." Daisy kept her eyes forward. "I'm just trying to understand what happens now." "Well," Russell said, adjusting the reins. Now you come home with me. It ain't much. Just a cabin I built a few years back. Needs repairs, roof leaks when it storms. But it's quiet. Nobody bothers us. Nobody bothers us. The words slid into Daisy like a warm coat on a winter night. When they reached the cabin, a modest wooden structure near a thin creek, Daisy stepped down from the cart and stared. The house was small, maybe 20 feet long, with a tin chimney and a porch big enough for 2 chairs. The door leaned slightly, and the windows were patched with old flour sacks, but it looked lived in. Russell didn't rush her. "You can look around," he said. "Your room's the one on the left. You don't have to stay in the same room as me. Not unless you want to." Daisy blinked. Choices. That was new. She walked inside slowly. The place smelled of cedar and firewood. A half-built table sat in one corner. A kettle rested near the stove. It was poor, simple, rough around the edges. But it was clean. And no one yelled. No one hit her. No one watched her with disgust. Russell set her small bundle of belongings on a shelf. "You hungry?" he asked. "I've got beans and cornbread." Daisy felt her throat tighten. It wasn't the food. It was the tone, gentle, steady, without expectation. "Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." They sat at the small table. The meal was plain but warm. Daisy didn't speak much, but her shoulders slowly loosened. Russell didn't pry. He didn't hover. He just existed beside her, calm and unobtrusive. When the plates were empty and the fire burned low, Russell stood. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, you won't face it alone." For a moment, Daisy thought she might cry, but she held it in. "Good night," she murmured. "Good night, Daisy." She walked to the small left-hand room, closed the door gently, and sat on the edge of the bed. A real bed. Not quilts on a dirty attic floor. No cheering crowds. No fairy tale magic. Just a cabin, a stranger, and a chance to breathe freely for the first time in her life. And for Daisy Elwood, that was more than enough. For now. The first morning in Russell's cabin surprised Daisy more than anything had in years. She woke not to shouting or footsteps on the stairs, but to the crackle of firewood and the faint smell of coffee drifting under her door. The room was quiet, washed in a thin strip of sunlight coming through the patched window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her heart jolted, expecting the familiar fear. Isabel storming in, Faye hissing insults, Clara yanking the blankets away. But the only sound was a sparrow tapping at the windowsill. She sat up slowly, feeling the weight of her own freedom like a new, unfamiliar coat. Russell's voice carried softly from the next room. "Breakfast's ready whenever you are." He didn't knock. He didn't push. He simply let her know. When she stepped into the main room, Russell was stirring a pot of beans on the stove. He glanced over his shoulder. "Morning." "Good morning," she said softly. He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it in front of her. She hesitated before taking a sip. She hadn't been offered warm drinks often. The bitterness filled her mouth, strange but comforting. "You sleep all right?" he asked. Daisy nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." Russell didn't ask questions about her past. He never did. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was space. Space Daisy had never been given before. After breakfast, Russell showed her the small creek behind the cabin. Willow branches hung over the water, and the earth around it was soft. A few stones formed a stepping path. Daisy knelt to touch the water. It was colder than she expected, crisp and clear. "You can wash clothes here," Russell said. "Or fetch water in the afternoons. Just watch for snakes in the rocks." Daisy nodded. "Thank you." They settled into a rhythm over the next few days. Slow, tentative, but steady. Daisy cleaned the cabin. Not because she was told to, but because she wanted it to feel like home. Russell spent hours mending tools or chopping firewood. When she offered to help, he looked unsure at first, as if afraid of asking too much. But she insisted. and soon they worked side by side in the yard, their movements quiet and synchronized. One afternoon, Daisy's sleeve slipped back, revealing a long bruise along her forearm, a fading stain from one of Isabel's rages. Russell saw it as he was fixing the porch step. He paused, hammer in hand. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. She glanced at the bruise, then shrugged. "Not anymore." "That's a heavy mark," he said quietly. "Someone did that with intention." Daisy didn't deny it. She didn't need to. The truth sat plain between them. Russell set the hammer aside and opened a small wooden box under the porch. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, strips of cotton, and jars filled with salve. "My mother taught me some healing," he said. "Apache ways. Not magic. Just plants that know how to help a person mend." He took her arm carefully, his touch gentle. Daisy stiffened at first. Instinct, fear. But she didn't pull away. Russell dabbed a salve along the bruise. The cool mixture eased the soreness. "That'll help the color fade," he said. "You got other bruises? You tell me." Daisy let out a small breath, somewhere between a sigh and a sob. "No one ever cared if I bruised," she whispered. Russell met her eyes. "I care." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't pity. It was simple fact, spoken plainly. That night, as they sat on the porch steps under a sky full of stars, Daisy said quietly, "I don't know why you're being this kind to me." Russell leaned back against the rail, arms folded loosely. "Ain't kindness," he replied. "It's what folks should do. Everyone deserves a place to rest. A place where someone ain't yelling all the time." Daisy stared at the grain of the wood beneath her hands. "I don't know how to rest," she admitted. "You will," Russell said. "Takes time." By the end of the second week, Daisy's face had changed. Not in beauty, but in expression. The tightness around her mouth softened. Her shoulders didn't curl inward as much. She began humming under her breath when she cooked or scrubbed the table. Small things. Quiet things. But real. Then one warm evening, a writer came from Kansas with a packet of letters and notices. Russell met him at the fence, paid the 15 cents postage, and brought the papers inside. "You got something," he told Daisy, handing her a folded document. Daisy's heart skipped. The notice was short and cold. "Elwood property foreclosed. Establishment evacuated. Isabel Elwood and dependents have vacated the premises." Below it, a brief scrawled note from a neighbor Daisy barely knew. "They ran off last night. Owed too many people. House is empty." Daisy read it twice, then again. Her hands trembled slightly. Russell watched her, not pushing. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. Daisy closed the paper carefully. "I'm not glad," she said. "But I'm not sorry either." Russell nodded, as if that was exactly the right answer. "They lived cruel," he said. "The world catches up to folks like that." She looked up at him, the lantern light flickering across her face. "I used to think I deserved everything they did," she admitted. "Now I'm not sure." Russell stepped closer, his voice low. "You didn't deserve a bit of it. Not one bruise, not one word." Something warm spread through her chest. Not passion, not romance, just the slow return of self-worth. Fragile, but steady. Daisy looked down, a small smile tugging at her lips for the first time in years. "Thank you," she whispered. Russell hesitated, then said in a tone lighter than before, "For what?" "For helping me remember I'm a person." She lifted her gaze. "A real person." Russell's eyes softened. "You always were. Just needed space to breathe." And they stood like that for a long moment. Not touching, not confessing anything. Just existing in the same quiet warmth. And for Daisy, that was healing. Slow, imperfect, but real. The kind of healing the Wild West rarely granted anyone. She wasn't beautiful now. She wasn't transformed. But she was becoming whole, piece by piece. And Russell stood like a steady pillar beside her. Not saving her, not rescuing her, but being someone she could lean on as she learned how to walk into her own life. But Kansas wasn't quite done with them yet. Summer settled over the plains in long strokes of heat and gold. The wheat fields swayed like restless waves, and the cicadas sang loud enough to fill the silence between one breath and the next. Life around Russell's cabin took on its own steady heartbeat. Slow, but certain. Simple, but honest. Daisy adjusted to it the way a wounded animal might adjust to a safe pasture. Not all at once. Not easily. But gradually. She woke early each morning to the sound of Russell splitting kindling or feeding the mare. She learned which floorboards creaked, which shelves he'd built himself, which tools he'd repaired so many times they'd taken on the shape of his hands. She learned to bake cornbread without burning it, to chop vegetables without cutting her fingers, to patch shirts that had seen too many windy days. Russell worked long hours, hunting in the mornings, cooking for the trade outpost twice a week, chopping wood to sell when supplies ran low. Sometimes Daisy helped. Sometimes she sat outside peeling potatoes while the sun warmed her face. He didn't judge her pace. He didn't expect her to be more than what she was, a woman trying her best after surviving too much. One late afternoon, while Russell repaired a broken wagon wheel outside, Daisy lingered in the doorway, watching him work. Sweat darkened his shirt, and sawdust clung to the cuffs of his pants. His hands were rough, sure, steady. Unlike the careless hands that had bruised her for years. "Can I help?" she asked. He looked up, not surprised. Over the weeks, she'd begun offering more often. "You can hold it steady," he said, nodding at the wheel. She knelt beside him in the dirt, fingers brushing the wood. Together, they turned the wheel, guiding new spokes into place. Their shoulders nearly touched. Daisy felt the warmth of his presence, solid and grounding. When the wheel finally settled right, Russell sat back on his heels. "That's good work," he said. She brushed dirt from her skirt, cheeks warming a little. "You taught me." Russell smiled, not wide, not showy, just enough to soften the edges of his face. Later that evening, as dusk stretched across the sky in a wash of pink and gray, they ate dinner on the porch, beans, leftover rabbit, and strong tea. The world felt open then, quiet, but alive. Russell leaned back against the porch post. "I heard something in town today," he said. Daisy tensed slightly. Even from miles away, Kansas had a way of reaching in like a claw. "What is it?" "Isabel and her girls are long gone," he said. "Folks said they headed west, maybe toward Colorado, owing money to half the county." Daisy absorbed the words slowly. She didn't feel triumph or joy, just release. "So it's over," she whispered. "Yeah," Russell replied. "It's over." She watched the prairie, the tall grass swaying like it had waited all these years just for her to step beyond the shadows. "I used to think I'd always be trapped," Daisy said. "That no matter where I went, I'd carry their voices with me." "You might," Russell said. But he said it gently, not as a warning. "Sometimes the past follows, but it doesn't get to decide where you go." She considered that, letting the words settle. Russell took a breath, shifting in his chair. "Daisy, I want to say something plain." She looked at him, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not for the roof, not for the food, not for the name we share now. You came because you needed a way out, and I respect that. But I want you to know you can stay because you choose to, not because of the marriage paper, not because you feel you have nowhere else." Daisy stared at him, stunned by the weight and gentleness of the words. Back in Kansas, every room she'd lived in felt like a cage. Even the air had been borrowed. But here, in this rough little cabin with its patched windows and crooked porch, she felt something she didn't quite recognize at first. Home. Not because it was pretty, not because it was warm, but because she wasn't afraid inside it. She swallowed, tightening her fingers around the tin cup. "I do choose to stay," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd say something like that and mean it, but I do." Russell's shoulders eased, the tension leaving him visibly. There was a long stretch of silence. Not uncomfortable, but meaningful. The kind that comes only when two people have stopped pretending and started living in truth. Finally, Daisy asked, "And you? Why did you do all this? Why take someone like me in?" Russell tilted his head, studying the horizon before answering. "You survived more than most folks ever see," he said. "That takes strength, a different kind of strength. I figured someone like that deserves better than what they got." He paused, then added quietly, "Besides, I like having you here." Daisy's chest tightened, not with fear, but with that slow-growing warmth she'd felt more and more around him. She set her cup down and looked at Russell fully, honestly. "I like being here," she said. "With you." His eyes softened, and for the first time, Daisy saw something in them she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. Affection. Quiet and deep. The wind stirred the prairie grass. The sun dipped low. A coyote called somewhere in the vast distance. Russell stood and offered her his hand. Not as a command, not as a gesture of ownership, but as a simple invitation. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go inside. It gets cold after sunset." She placed her hand in his, steady this time, not trembling, not afraid. He helped her up, and together they walked toward the small cabin. Not a palace, not a fairy tale. Just two people the world had nearly broken, choosing to build something steady out of the pieces left. And in the wide, unforgiving plains of the Wild West, that was more than enough to call it a life. In the end, Daisy and Russell proved that even in a hard, unforgiving world, two wounded souls could build a life worth living. Quiet, honest, and entirely their own. Their story stands as a reminder that healing may be slow, but it is real. And love often grows in places no one expects, in the quiet moments between sunrise and sunset, in hands held steady against the wind, in words spoken plainly without pretense. Daisy never became beautiful in the way Kansas defined beauty, but she became whole. She became herself. And that was worth more than any grand ball or approving glance. Russell never became wealthy or respected in the way the territory measured such things, but he became someone worth trusting, someone worth choosing. And that was worth more than any title or fortune. Together, they carved out a life on the edge of civilization, where nobody bothered them, and the only voices that mattered were their own. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment below. Your support helps me keep creating meaningful stories like this one. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.